Everyone. I'm Rabbi Alicia Magal from the Jewish community of Sedona and the Verde Valley. And we need to talk. We need to come together as community. We need to understand better what is going on in this war. Today is October 18th. We're over a week into Swords of Iron after the massacre from Hamas into Israel. I'd like to introduce my good friend, Dan Gordon, who is a writer, director, producer, novelist, playwright. My very good friend Tova Feldshuh was in one of his plays, Irena's Vow, maybe some of you saw it. And for our Shavuot a few years ago, Dan led the most amazing talk on Psalm 23 and the life of King David. He's like a brother to Yitzhak. He also spent his teen years in Israel as on a kibbutz. He was part of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, an active duty in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War, many years in counterterrorism with his unit, and several operations. Unfortunately, this is not the first one that he has seen and is commenting on. He was spokesperson for the IDF 2002 and 2009 and 2013 and 14. And even as an older gentleman, he wanted to do a documentary on the Givati, which is one of the units in Israel. And he said, I'm not going to write about you unless I go through what you go through. And he himself volunteered to do a grueling training and a forced march. And at the end of it, red-faced and bruised, he got that beret, and he was honored in a way that no one else has ever done. They kept coming up with the Jeep and saying, okay, old man, are you ready to give up? And he went, not yet, not yet. So that's our Dan. So Dan, tell us, because we're getting bombarded by news that is very, very upsetting, especially in Israel. So different from what you hear on Israel TV that Yitzhak and I have been watching. So we'd love an overview and from your perspective, Dan.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be on. And yes, everything you said is true. I love Itzik like a brother, and there's a song in Hebrew that says we're both from the same village, and that's how we've always felt about it. And we really, both of us were from the same village. We both were kids in kibbutz without our families, and lived a very similar life and grew up in a very similar time period. And for a brief time after the Yom Kippur War, we were actually stationed at the same base, and we didn't know we were both there at Ramat David. So that was, the small world of Israel. I thought that the best thing would be to try and put this into some kind of context, because this is, I'm a screenwriter, and this is following a script that I could have written ahead of time almost, in terms of the change of the narrative, which started out with great sympathy for Israel because we were attacked, and has now shifted to antipathy for Israel from a lot of quarters, based on a lie, which we now know is a lie. Literally a blood libel, modern day blood libel, which doesn't matter. The truth really will not matter to the people who hate Jews and hate Israel. And now the narrative is the poor, suffering Palestinian people who are being oppressed and have been oppressed for 75 years by the cruel occupation of the white colonialist settler apartheid state of Israel. So to put that in perspective, the first time I was ever shot at in my life, not the last, but certainly the first, was at a place called Nahal Oz, which is in Otef Azah, which is called the Gaza envelope. It's right on the border with Gaza. And it is one of those kibbutzim where on October 6th, what we now know were 2,000 Hamas terrorists. Start with 1,000, and they said maybe 1,500, and now we know it was 2,000 Hamas terrorists. Came in, and one of the kibbutzim in which they came in and slaughtered people was Nahal Oz. And the first time I was shot at was in 1963. in Nachal Oz. I left my kibbutz, which was an older established kibbutz called Ginegar, which was located in the valley of Jezreel. And I wanted to go to a young kibbutz which had a bit more of a pioneering spirit. My kibbutz was already 40 years old, and I wanted to be around primarily young people, which is what Nachal Oz was at that time. And so I went there to volunteer for a few weeks, and I was assigned to plant a palm tree or a row of palm trees with another kid. And the crime for which we were shot at was planting palm trees while being Jewish. And we were shot at, there was no Hamas at that time, they were called Fedayun. And they were the terrorists who came in from Gaza as part of there was no PLO at that time. It was the Palestine Liberation Army, it was the PLA, headed up by a chap by the name of Ahmed Shukeri. And I say this because at the time there was no occupation. There were no settlements. The occupied territories that the Arabs referred to and that the PLA referred to were Tel Aviv and Haifa. Those were referred to as the occupied territories. And to put it more into context, in the 1920s, there were similar massacres that took place, one in Jaffa and one in Hebron, of the Jews who lived there. Hebron was a Jewish community which had been occupied by Jews almost nonstop for 3,000 years. It's the home of the tomb of the patriarchs. Abraham is buried there. Sarah is buried there. It's where literally our patriarchs and matriarchs lived. It's where Abraham bought his tomb. It's where King David was first crowned king before there was a Jerusalem. He was crowned king in Hebron. And the Jewish community in Hebron was wiped out in that massacre in the late 20s. And then in the 30s as well, there was the so-called Arab Revolt. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, the history of that. And Jews were once again massacred. It's not new to us. And it's not a question of settlements, and it's not a question of occupation, and it's not a question of denying the poor Palestinian people their rights, because there was no Jewish state when this happened. And in 1963, when I was shot at, there were no settlements, there was no occupation, there was no settlement movement, there was no apartheid state. All the hypocritical claims that are being used to justify mass murder. And I will tell you that as a screenwriter, someone who makes a living by language, I'm struck by the poverty of the English language, which doesn't contain a word to describe what happened on October 6th. There is no English word that I know that encompasses what our people suffered. It's not pogrom. Pogrom doesn't do it. Massacre doesn't do it. Slaughter doesn't do it. There's no word that encompasses the horrors that went on there, which I'll go into, and I'll ask you to forgive me up front for the graphic images that you'll hear about. But 7 years before I was shot at Nachal Oz, there was a young boy who was one of the founders of Nachal Oz by the name of Roy Rotenberg, who was shot at April 19th, 1956. He was wounded. His body was dragged off the kibbutz. He was tortured, and then he was finally shot again. His body was found, and they buried him. And Moshe Dayan, who was then the chief of staff of the Israeli army, delivered his eulogy. And I'd ask that you listen to it, because this was, like I say, 67 years ago. And it reads as relevantly today as it did then. It's unbelievably prophetic, unbelievably descriptive of what just happened on October 6th, not just in 1956. This is what Dayan said. Early yesterday morning, Roy was murdered. The quiet of the spring morning dazzled him, and he did not see those waiting in ambush for him at the edge of the field. How did we shut our eyes and refuse to look squarely at our fate and see in all its brutality the destiny of our generation? Beyond this border, a sea of hatred is swelling, awaiting the day when serenity will dull our path, for the day when we will heed the ambassadors of malevolent hypocrisy who will call upon us to lay down our arms. Roi's blood is crying out to us and only us from his shredded body. Although we swore 1,000 times that our blood would not flow in vain, yesterday we were seduced. We listened. We believed. We will make a reckoning with ourselves today. For without the steel helmet and the cannon's barrel, we will not be able to plant a tree or build a home. Let us not be deterred from seeing the loathing that is inflaming and filling the lives of hundreds of thousands of Arabs who live around us and await the moment in which their hand will be able to attain our blood. Let us not avert our eyes, lest our arms weaken. This is the fate of our generation, to be prepared and armed and strong and determined, lest the sword be stricken from our hand and our lives be cut down. The young Roi, who left Tel Aviv to build his home at the gates of Gaza, to be a wall for us, was blinded by the light in his heart, and he did not see the flash of the sacrificial knife. The yearning for peace deafened his ears, and he did not hear the voice of murder lying in ambush. That is 67 years ago. Absolutely nothing has changed. The names of the terrorists are no longer Fedayeen, they're Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The hatred is the same. They released footage today of the interrogation of 2 terrorists who were caught. And they said, "What did you come here to do? What were your orders?" And they said, "Kill Jews." And asked, "Why?" No reason. Because we're Jews. By the way, they don't refer to us as Israelis. They never refer to us as Israelis. I was a spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces in both 2008-9, 2011-12, and 2014 in Gaza. And my opposite number was the guy who's still the spokesperson for Hamas. His name is Abu Obeda. And he once told a reporter who relayed the story to me, he said, "Oh, the Israelis have hired a Hollywood screenwriter to write their fantasies." And he was asked by this reporter what the difference was between Hamas and ISIS. And he was very offended. He said, "How dare you ask such a question? We're nothing at all like ISIS. ISIS kills civilians wantonly." And the reporter said, "But you kill civilians as well." He said, "No, that's a total lie. We never kill civilians. We only kill Jews." That's the mentality. I think for a lot of folks, they believe that the history of the Middle East began last week, or it began last night. It began when the hospital was bombed and X hundred number of people tragically were killed. So let me give you a brief overview, which may be old news to some of you and new news to others. Let's start with the lie that this was the Palestinian state was robbed by the Jews, by the white supremacist, colonialist, imperialist, supremacist Zionist entity. And of course, everyone knows that Itzik is European and fits that description perfectly. As the majority of our population in Israel is made up of people whose families have lived in the Middle East for 1,000 years before Muhammad's mother was born. There has never been in the history of the world a state called Palestine. No such state ever existed. There were never any borders of a state called Palestine. There was never any currency of a place called Palestine. There was never a leader of a place called Palestine. The area that we refer to today as Israel, Jordan, the West Bank or Judea, Samaria, and Gaza was the scene of the crossover of the Jews led by Joshua ben Nun after Moses, as they came into what was then the Palestine, the promised land. And that land was composed of Canaanites. And Joshua ben Nun led a very successful military campaign, and the Israelites conquered that area. And they lived a tribal existence. Different tribes in different parts of the country. There was no central government. They were ruled during that time by a period of judges. We know the names of those judges: Gideon, Deborah, the time of Samson, who, by the way, was perhaps the first Jewish hostage taken to Gaza. And it didn't work out too well for the Philistines in the end. Roughly 600-700 years before the Common Era, the Jews began to yearn for a king, and Saul became the first king of Israel, and David, after him, united both Judea and Israel and formed the kingdom of Israel with Jerusalem as his capital. Jerusalem had been a Jebusite city. David conquered it. He wanted to have a sort of Washington, D.C. that didn't belong to any particular tribe so that everyone could embrace it. And he brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem to give it a legitimacy. It was the divine presence was there as well. And after David's line of kings, which Solomon, the kingdom split into two. It became vulnerable. There were numbers of enemies. There was a Babylonian exile. Then came the line of the Hasmonean kings, that's the story of Hanukkah, who rebelled against the Syrian Greeks. And after the line of Hasmonean kings, there was a conquest by the Romans. And there was an appointed Jewish puppet king named Herod, who built the second temple. Herod's temple was magnificent, and that's what the Western Wall is today. It's the last retaining wall of the temple built by Herod. In 70 AD, the Jewish revolt ended, and the Romans conquered Masada, which was the last Jewish outpost. And we all know the story of Masada. The defenders of Masada chose to commit suicide and die as free men and women rather than fall into captivity and be slaves of the Romans. And then Bar Kokhba, about 60 years later, staged a revolt. And that was the last independent Jewish Commonwealth until 1948. So you had a 2,000-year period where the Jews are exiled, forcibly exiled and dispersed by the Romans. And as a final insult to the Jewish people, who were a real pain in the ass to the Romans, they were really glad to be rid of us. they decided that Judea, from which we get the name Jews, would no longer be called Judea. And they made up a name called Syria Palestina. And the reason that they chose that name was to further insult the Jews, because Palestina came from the word Philistines, who were the arch enemies of the Jews at the time of the Jewish commonwealths. So it was rubbing our noses into it. And thus was born this name of Palestine, which was a Roman invention. Shechem, which is a Jewish city, was renamed Neapolis by the Romans. It's a Latin word that was corrupted into Arabic, to what they call Nablus. But before, long before, 1,000 years before it was ever Neapolis, it was Shechem. The area of Judea and Samaria were the heartland of our people. In the late 1880s, there became a desire to return to our ancestral homeland. But the Jews, there were always a trickle of Jews who lived there. There was an uninterrupted period of Jewish inhabitation, with the exception of a brief period when the Crusaders, who killed us and the Muslims with equal relish, banned Jews from the Holy Land. And then under Muslim rule, we were invited back in by Salah ad-Din, whose closest advisor was our greatest Jewish sage, was the Rambam. And he was the sort of Henry Kissinger of his era. And he was the closest advisor to Salah ad-Din. So in the 1880s, there was a real movement, because the Jews of Eastern Europe were suffering so much, of we've tried assimilation, we've tried enlightenment. You know, the Jews, we've been hated because in almost every place that we lived, we were forced out of every profession except the professions that were despised by our host nations. So Jews were forced into money lending, because that was usury. Christians were not allowed to do it. Well, we got good at it. And we created fortunes for city-states like Venice. Shakespeare writes about it in the play The Merchant of Venice. We succeeded very well in the very professions that we were stuck in because they were unfit for Christians. And then we turned those into things that were profitable. So we were hated for being successful. And in the countries where we were hated for being poor. And when we resisted, we were hated for resisting. And when we tried to assimilate, we were hated because we were trying to be like them. And when we converted to Christianity, we weren't Christian enough. But at the same time, we were too Jewish. And then we weren't Jewish enough. We were trying to look like them. How dare we? And we stubbornly clung to our faith that entire time, and to the Hebrew language as a language of prayer. And finally, in the 1880s, there began to be a movement of return to our homeland. And my father was part of that movement. My dad was born in 1895, and he was there for the rebirth of the Hebrew language as a living language. And my dad came from 12 generations of Hasidic rabbis. My dad's grandfather was a very famous rabbi in Eastern Europe. He was known as De Blinde Rebbe. He had gone blind, and he was an Av Beit Din. He was the chief justice of the rabbinical court. But because he had memorized the Talmud and all the tractates, he could still render his judgments as a judge, even though he couldn't read them and there was no Braille. So he was very famous as the Blinde Rebbe. And he decided he was going to go to the Holy Land to die. He went there as an old man, and his plans didn't work out. He lived to be 112 years old, and he became a very famous rabbi in Jerusalem. And when he died, it was front page news in the Hebrew language paper of the day called Chavatzelet, and I still have a copy of that. It was literally front page news when he died. So I sort of know that period of history because it's my family's history. And these young Jews who said, we're going to revitalize It was an amazing story. We're going to revitalize the Hebrew language. We're going to go to Israel to build it and be built up by it. That was the pioneering song. Livnot v'lehibanot ba. We're going up to Israel. Anu banu arza. We went up to the land to build and be built up by it. And there was that incredible feeling. And that became the first Aliyah, and that was before World War I. In World War I, that area of land that Herzl, Theodor Herzl, who the founder of the Zionist movement, was trying to negotiate as a Jewish, not homeland, a Jewish state that would be reborn, that land was part of the Ottoman Empire. And Herzl negotiated with the Ottoman Empire. They began buying up land. Jews would have the little pushkas that they put money into, the blue and white tin box, and they would put in their zlotys and their kopecks and their pennies. And the Jewish National Fund became a reality, and it began to buy at exorbitant prices what was truly worthless land. So there was no Palestinian land that was stolen from anybody. It was bought and paid for, overpaid for, exorbitant prices. And then young people went and reclaimed that land. And they formed kibbutzim and moshavim, little collective villages. They formed little towns, Zichron Yaakov, Rosh Pina. These that were sponsored, some of them by the Baron Rothschild, who was very philanthropic and paid for land. And so land was developed for any kind of taste one had, and they even had the temerity to create a new city on the sand dunes outside of Jaffa, and it was called Tel Aviv, and it was truly worthless. It was nothing but sand dunes. And in World War I, the Jews decided to side against their host country, the Ottoman Empire, with the Allies, because they believed that if the Ottoman Turks could be defeated by the democracies, they had great faith in Great Britain and in the United States, that the Jews would be able to lay claim and say, we were part of the victory. And now it's time for the little indigenous peoples, which is what we are. We are the indigenous people of Israel. We speak the same language that was spoken there 2,000 years ago. We worship the same God. We read the same Torah. If there was a DNA project of the Kohanim that shows the people who were called Kohanim genetically match all over the world, whether they're in Africa or Eastern Europe or Iraq or Iran, the Kohanim are genetically linked together. So the idea that we are related to some Eastern Europe, Kazakh, Karaite groups is pure and utter nonsense. So there were two fighting forces that were formed in World War I. One was the Jewish Legion, and the other was the Zion Mule Corps. They both fought with distinction at Gallipoli. But more important than either of those was a spy ring called the Nili Spies that operated out of a place called Zichron Yaakov. And no less a person than General Allenby credited the Nili Spies with the intelligence that was necessary for the conquest of what is today Palestine by British forces. And when Allenby marched triumphantly into Jerusalem, he acknowledged the fact that it was the Nili Spies who got him there. After World War I, the League of Nations held something called the San Remo Conference, in San Remo, Italy. And at that conference, the Zionist movement presented its case for a Jewish, not just homeland, but a Jewish state. The idea of a Jewish homeland was first born in the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Lord Balfour, who was the British Foreign Secretary, said His Majesty's government looks with favor on the creation of a Jewish homeland in the area of Palestine. And he did that to get Jewish support, which was necessary for the Allies in World War I. And we delivered. And so it was time for them to deliver on their promises as well. And there were other small peoples who wanted their independence as well, and they got screwed. The Armenians were one of them. They were left under the the Turkish yoke, and everyone knows about the Armenian genocide that actually happened twice. Once before World War I, and there was another one that happened in the 1950s. And the Jews presented their case, and no less than T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, became an ardent Zionist and supported the Jewish claims. And so at the San Remo conference, the League of Nations said the Jews deserve a state, but they're not yet ready to govern themselves. I guess we were too primitive. We didn't understand the notion of government or democracy. So they said, we will give to Great Britain the mandate over Palestine, and that mandate will be with one purpose: to prepare a Jewish state. The Brits did not take the mandate because of their overwhelming kindness and wish to be of social service to the still unborn Jewish state. They took it because they wanted to guard their oil interests. There was a pipeline that ran from Iraq to Haifa, which is of great strategic value to them. And they were not about to give up their influence in the Middle East. So they said, yes, we'll be the protectors. But before we do that, we're going to lop off 70% of what was Palestine. 70%. And we're going to say that actually isn't Palestine. We're going to create the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So they got a cousin of the deposed king of what is today Saudi Arabia, who was defeated by the Saud family. And they installed Abdullah as the Hashemite king of Jordan. Well, there had never been a country called Jordan in the history of the world. There was no such thing as a Jordanian people. And Abdullah became the king of Jordan. So 70% of our patrimony, of what was to be the area for the Jewish state, was lopped off, right off. That literally created the first Arab state. The first partition was the creation of an Arab state called the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. From the time of the San Remo conference up until 1948, the Jews continued to immigrate to Israel and to build it up into a thriving, amazing, tiny country. In the 1930s, the riots and the massacres that were being perpetrated against the Jews of Palestine, and by the way, during that period, the only people who called themselves Palestinians were Jews. The Arabs called themselves Arabs. The idea that they were quote unquote Palestinians was totally foreign to them. If you said a Palestinian did something, you were referring to the Jews of Palestine, and everybody knew it. My adoptive father, Hanan Greenwald, of blessed memory, who served in the Jewish Brigade in World War II, I have his flash that was on his uniform. And there was the Jewish Brigade insignia, which was a blue and white flag with the yellow Star of David to identify with the Jews of Europe under Nazi oppression. And above that, there was an arced patch that said Palestine. They were the Palestinians. That was the Jewish Brigade. So during that period of time, immigration increased. And then as Hitler came to power, it became apparent that the Jews needed a refuge. It was at this time during the 30s that there was another Arab revolt. And the Brits appointed a commission led by Lord Peel. And they recommended the creation of a Jewish state, a partition. And the Jewish state would be a tiny sliver of land along the coast that then turned right at the Valley of Jezreel and included about 70% of the Galilee. And the entire rest, all of the Negev, all of the waste of Israel, everything else was to be an Arab state. Israel was to get a place that was probably about the size of LA County. The Jews agreed. The Arabs, to a man, said no. No to a Jewish state of any size. So this conflict isn't about borders. It's not about the West Bank. It's not about Gaza. It's not. A Jewish state the size of a postage stamp is not acceptable to the people who hate us. And I don't mean all Arabs, and I don't mean all Palestinians. Obviously not. We have peace agreements with numbers of Arab countries, and we've been able up until now to create a growing coalition of peaceful neighbors, so that the Arab-Israeli conflict basically up until this last massacre had ended, and it was reduced to an Iranian-sponsored Palestinian-Israeli conflict. when the Arabs turned down this little rump state that we were offered, David Ben-Gurion said, we'll take a state of any size because we're the last refuge for the Jews of Europe. The doors were closing. We're the only one who wants them. And at that time, the Nazis, incredibly, were saying Jews back to Palestine. They were willing to export the Jews of Germany to Palestine. The Brits, however, did not want to lose favor with the Arabs. And so they issued what was called the White Paper, which said there would be no further Jewish immigration to Palestine. That effectively sealed the fate of 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, because there was no country that would take them in. The one country that would have been the Jewish state, which was not yet born. And once again, we fought on the side of the Allies. And oddly enough, the head of, at that time, the Palestine movement was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. His name was Haj Amin al-Husseini. He spent World War II with Hitler in Berlin. He was a wanted war criminal because he trained Yugoslav Muslims to be death squads against Christians and Jews. So in 1948, we were born as a state when the UN partitions Israel into two countries, one Arab, one Jewish, and again the Jews said yes. And immediately on May 14th, 12:01 a.m., as soon as the mandate ended, Israel declared independence and at the same time was invaded by 5 Arab countries, and the local Jews of Palestine fought village against village, neighbor against neighbor. That war ended with Israel being victorious, and there were roughly 600,000 Palestinian Arab refugees who were displaced, and they ran for 2 reasons. Sometimes they ran because they were trying to get out of the war zone. Sometimes they ran because their leaders said, just get out of the way and we'll finish the Jews off in 2 weeks and you can come in and take over everything they have. And there were isolated places where we probably drove them out, but they were very few and far between. At the same time that those Palestinian Arabs were displaced, a larger number of Jews, of which Itzik was one, were forcibly displaced from the homes they had lived in for literally thousands of years. Iraq, Morocco, Yemen, even Saudi Arabia had a Jewish community, tiny, but it was still there. So Israel now absorbed between 700,000 and 800,000 Jewish refugees. There was a switch in populations. To put it into context, at the end of World War II, there were 11 million refugees in Europe, all of whom were settled finally in one country or another by 1961. A strange thing happened in the United Nations. There are 2 types of refugees recognized in the world. All the refugees on planet Earth in one group, and over them is the UN High Commissioner on Refugees. And they have one set of rules, which says as soon as you're in a country where you're resettled, you're no longer a refugee. And then there is the Palestinians, who are ruled over by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Welfare Association, with a totally different set of rules, which says you are refugees forever. Your great-great-great-great-grandchildren will always be refugees. No matter where you live, in what country you live, no matter how prosperous you may become, you are still, according to the UN, on the books as a Palestinian refugee. Gigi Haddad, the supermodel, who makes more than several cities combined, and her sister, they're sort of Kardashian light, is still a refugee because her father is Palestinian. And so the benighted status of refugee passes on to her and will pass on to her children as well. And UNRWA has been responsible for the quote unquote refugee camps. Why there are still refugee camps 75 years after a war ended, when Europe was able to resettle 11 million refugees in less than 20 years after World War II ended, is beyond me, but there it is. So this notion of refugees has been perpetuated, and literally they are incubators for hatred. The hatred was always there, but they ratcheted it up. So in 1967, Israel fought the Six-Day War, and at that time came into possession in a defensive war, by the way, not one that it was started literally by Egypt closing the Straits of Tiran, which is an act of war. And Jordan actually began shelling Israel and joined in late into the Six-Day War. And Israel kept telling King Hussein, stay out of it, stay out of it. We don't want to be at war with you. He made the worst mistake of his life, and he joined the war, and he lost the West Bank, and he lost Jerusalem. So all of a sudden we had Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Gaza had been taken over illegally by Egypt at 1948, and the entire West Bank had been taken over illegally by Jordan. And by the way, nobody said that they were settlers. Nobody said that they were an apartheid state. Nobody said these were occupied territories, though they certainly were, because they weren't Jews who were doing it. That cleanses it and makes it entirely different. At the end of 67, Abba Eban famously said to the Arab states, prepare to be amazed by our generosity. Because after the 67 war, we basically offered to return all the territories, all of them, all of Sinai, the Golan Heights, all of the West Bank, and Gaza, give them back to Syria, give them back to Egypt, give them back to Jordan in return for peace. And in return for that offer, we got the 3 no's of Khartoum: no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel, and no peace. So what does one do in that situation? We have a claim to that land. That land was acquired in a defensive war. We have a biblical claim to that land. And rightly or wrongly, we began to allow settlements to be built in that land. Because people were returning, there was a religious fervor to return to our biblical homeland. In 2005, and there were 21 settlements, if I'm not wrong, in Gaza. In 2005, Ariel Sharon unilaterally decided to pull out of Gaza, and in one of the most painful operations in the history of the Israeli army did something which, if we had done it to Palestinians, would have been called a war crime. We went into all those 21 settlements and pulled out Jews out of their homes, their synagogues, their farms, their places of business, forcibly pulled them out. And it was a horrific scene. It was cousin against cousin, and sometimes it was brother against brother. And the soldiers were in tears as they had to pull their people out. And yet they did it, and they did it for one purpose: to give peace a chance. The idea was called Gaza First. We held out our hand and said, let Gaza become the Singapore of the Middle East, which it could have become. As we were pulling out, the PLO, not Hamas, began shelling us with rockets. We left behind some of the most advanced hothouse agriculture in the entire world, which would have supplied jobs to thousands of Palestinians. And we could have blown it up, as armies are wont to do with their assets when they leave a territory. We left them completely intact, in several of them with instruction manuals in Arabic about how to use the irrigation systems. The PLO blew them all up. Didn't keep one. They turned them into rocket launchers. It backfired on the PLO, because in 2006, Hamas won the parliamentary elections. Hamas was elected, as was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler didn't stage a coup to become Chancellor of Germany. The German people made a tragic mistake. They knew who Adolf Hitler was. They knew who the Nazi Party was. They elected Hitler. They put the Nazis in power. The people of Gaza elected Hamas to their legislative council. They knew who Hamas was. Hamas didn't hide who they were or what their desire was, which was to annihilate the Jewish state. The charter of Hamas, just so you know, says we will look forward to the fulfillment of the promise of Allah, when the Muslims will rise up and kill the Jews, and the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, "O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." Prophetic words, prophetic words. It's exactly what happened on October 6th. 260 Jewish boys and girls attending a music festival for peace, hiding behind rocks and trees and bushes. And then they were slaughtered. 260 bodies piled together. So we left. Hamas wins the municipal elections, but the Palestine Authority, which was run by the PLO, was still nominally in charge. They still had, presidential power, legislative power. They still maintained the presidential power. Hamas rose up against the PLO, and they brutally lined up 300 of their Palestinian brethren. We didn't do that, they did, and they machine gunned them all. And those that they wanted to have more fun with, they blindfolded, took to the tops of buildings and pushed them off. The YouTube videos of it were still there up until a couple of years ago. That's how Hamas became the ruling party of Gaza. Since then, we've had to fight wars with Hamas, which they started in 2008-9, 2009-10, 2011-12, and 2014. We made a terrible mistake, just like Moshe Dayan's eulogy. We shut our eyes and refused to look squarely at our fate and see it in all its brutality. There was a conceptia, a concept, that Hamas was now interested in the economic well-being of its citizens, and they wouldn't risk a war. That was the concept. It led to an intelligence failure worse than the intelligence failure of the Yom Kippur War, because that didn't cost civilian lives. The concept was the attack that we suffered from the Gazan side was supposed to take place in the north. We had put our most elite units on the northern borders. We expected exactly this kind of attack, but we expected it from Hezbollah. So they had our eyes looking north, and the attack came from the south. And I believe, and this is my belief, but it's grounded in reality, we know that there were 3 major summits between the Iranians, Hezbollah, and Hamas in Lebanon. This operation probably was planned over the last year or two. I believe it was planned, financed, and coached by Iran and Hezbollah, and coordinated. And I believe they have a battle plan. And I think the first war objective was to scuttle the Saudi Israeli rapprochement or peace agreement, and that war plan has already succeeded. That peace treaty, in the words of the Saudis, is now dead. It may not be, but it certainly is for now. That then brings us up to October 6th. I'm sure you've seen videos and heard reports, but that none of them touch the magnitude of the cruelty. Parents killed in front of their children's eyes, children killed in front of their parents' eyes, mothers tied with wire to their infants and then set on fire. We know that now because the forensic analysis found a mass. They didn't even know what it was until they took a CT scan and saw 2 spinal cords, one of an adult and one of a child, an infant. But there was something that they couldn't figure out. It was a black band that wound around it, and then they realized it was the wire that was tying them together. I won't go into the litany. We all know what happened. And now Israel is in a fight for its survival. quite literally. This isn't a war of choice. This isn't another operation. What they are waging against us is a war of annihilation, and we have a secret weapon. When the Taliban took over Afghanistan, they did not intend to wipe out the Afghan people. They intended to rule them. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they did not intend to wipe out the Ukrainian people. They intended to bring them back into the Russian Empire. We know what Hamas has in mind for us. If we don't, we're the stupidest people on the face of the earth. They just showed us. You know, I don't speak Arabic, but somehow through osmosis, as a kid in Israel, I learned two Arabic phrases just because I heard them so often. The first was, Palestine arduna wal Yehud kalbuna. Palestine is our land and the Jew is our dog. And the other one is simply Itbach al Yahud, kill the Jew. To this day, I don't know how I learned those phrases. They simply were so much in the air in 1963, 64, before there were territories, before there were settlements, before there were occupied lands. So that brings us to today. The only other thing left in this long presentation is the supposed bombing of the hospital. I'm assuming everybody saw today's news. Israel has laid out conclusive proof that this was not including a video that actually was taken in Gaza and first aired on Al Jazeera, which shows a rocket being launched and then failing and circling back and then exploding right where the hospital is. And even the BBC has geolocated it and said, yes, that is where the hospital is. There's another video that was taken by a security cam at Nativa Asara, which shows on the right-hand side of the screen rockets, a huge barrage of rockets being launched. It shows a couple of the rockets failing, starting to fall to the earth, and then on the left side of the screen, you see the explosion. There was no bomb crater, which Israeli ordnance would have left a huge bomb crater. There was the type of little pinprick craters that you see all over Israel when rockets fall, exactly the same kind. And there was a fireball. And the reason there was a fireball was because this was a failed rocket which had its full fuel load still in the rocket. So it created a conflagration. And that's what the majority of the injuries were from. We also have voice intercepts of two operatives who were talking about the fact, two Hamas operatives, that this was actually a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket which fell, and that it was fired from a cemetery behind the hospital compound, which fits the location that you see in the two videos. So we know from videos that we have, we know from aerial videos, you know, the way that Iron Dome works. It's a system of radar installations that track rockets from the moment that they're launched. So we have printouts from the Iron Dome because Iron Dome tracks every rocket that is launched. And if they see the rocket is going towards an empty field, we don't launch an anti-missile rocket towards it. That's the whole way Iron Dome works. So literally, Iron Dome tracks every rocket that is launched from Gaza. And so you see the trajectory of the rockets and one of those rockets which falls, and it falls on the hospital. So we have it from surveillance footage, we have it from the absence of a bomb crater, we have it from the fact that there was a conflagration which a bomb wouldn't have caused. A bomb is not a napalm bomb. Our ordnance, you've seen how Israeli bombs topple buildings, that they cause big explosions, not fireballs. This was from rocket fuel that wasn't expended. And we have, like I say, radar printouts from Iron Dome. There are 6 ways to Sundays. We have this thing mapped out. It doesn't matter. The blood libel is out there. And the Western media, the last thing I'll say, the Western media has blood on its hands because right now the Middle East is inflamed. And news outlets like CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post raced to put out the Hamas lies supposedly from the Palestine Health Ministry. Who is the Palestine Health Ministry? It's Hamas. So do you think that an organization that dispatched 2,000 people to murder men, women, children, infants in their bed, drag old ladies out of their wheelchairs and take them hostage, do you think they would blanch at telling an untruth? That would violate some code of honor that they have? That brings us up to today. Now, I believe that there will be a ground incursion with it probably within the next 48 to 72 hours. It is not going to be quick. It is not going to be elegant. It is an infantryman's worst nightmare. It is a three-dimensional battlefield. If we go into Gaza City, because Gaza City has skyscrapers, quite literally, they have high-rise apartment buildings. So you have snipers in those high-rise apartment buildings. Then you have people at street level who are going to be fighting you. And then you have an entire underground city, which is estimated to be larger than the London subway system, of tunnels, which are attack tunnels and storage tunnels and command and control tunnels where Hamas is hiding. So we will be fighting on a three-dimensional battlefield. It will be house to house and block to block. Israel will have to be very smart, very methodical. We can't just go charging into Gaza, and very destructive. And that campaign, if you want to put it into perspective, it took the Allies roughly 9 months to dislodge ISIS from Mosul, and Mosul wasn't as difficult as Gaza City will be. And my guess is we're talking about 6 to 9 months, optimistically. And we will do it because we don't have a choice. We can either be annihilated or we can win. So it makes life, in that regard, somewhat simple. There will be many military casualties. There will be many civilian casualties because Hamas hides behind its own civilians. And the calculus that they have is the more of our civilians that get killed, the better, because then, even though we're terrorists, we can wear the mantle of victimhood. And we can cry out, as they are now, ceasefire, ceasefire. Allow us. It's as though one of the Manson family had come into your house, raped your sister, killed your mother, slaughtered your baby in the crib. You hit him with a baseball bat, and then he said, I'm going to sue you for assaulting me. Ceasefire. Let's stop. This is too violent for me. So that is a somewhat gloomy assessment, but like I say, in the end, we have no choice but to win, and we will. And now, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Oh, Dan, that was magnificent, horrible, difficult, necessary, and thank you for that incredible lesson in history. I know that Israel wants to focus on the hostages and the barbaric massacre, but because of their own rocket fire and the displacement of civilians, it's turning the opinion and support of the world against Israel. So what can Israel do to further its goal and yet not give fuel to these news outlets that blame us that there's no aid getting to the people waiting at the Rafah crossing? I mean, nobody's talking about Egypt. Nobody's talking about anyone else. They're blaming everything on Israel. What can Israel do?
From a military point of view, it can do what it's going to do, which is to go into Gaza and defeat Hamas. From a PR point of view, we are notoriously bad at it. We've gotten a little bit better, but if you saw the presentation by the IDF chief spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, who is a fine sailor, he's a rear admiral in the Navy, but for whatever reason, which I have not been able to fathom, and I had shouting matches with generals. And it's one of the reasons I didn't retire as a lieutenant colonel and retired instead as a captain. You would not appoint a person who was a media PR expert to be the head of the Air Force because he doesn't know how to fly a plane. Why then would you appoint an admiral to be the head of your PR media arm, which is just as important in today's warfare? But Israel, for some reason, I've never been able to clearly understand it, puts in people who have no background in that profession. So if you saw his presentation where he was holding up little charts and the camera wasn't on a screen, which you should have been able to do as a PowerPoint presentation, it was amateur night in Dixie. The good news is they got it out relatively quickly for the amount of work that had to be done and the bureaucracy of the Israeli army. That you had people who were in charge of field security, bitachon sadeh, who have to sign off on revealing what you're going to reveal. And that's a bureaucracy that takes time to navigate. The fact that they got it out within 24 hours is a lot better than we used to do, but it isn't as good as we need to do. We need to have just like you have in politics, a whole team ready to respond immediately to whatever charge or misquote that the other side makes. We should have something like that that's more streamlined, and we don't yet, and I don't believe we will, because I know the IDF spokesman unit, and they will do as good a job as they can do, but their approach is amateurish.
Dan, I want to ask you, what do you think is the bigger picture? Iran, U.S., the post-war governing of Gaza, because Egypt doesn't want it. Will it be the Palestinian Authority again? I mean, how do we not turn the next generation into another radical group that, because they're being traumatized by the losses, and they're not blaming Hamas, they're blaming Israel. So how do we look to the bigger picture and to the future to create a more hopeful situation?
I think you need to step back and go to what I was talking about earlier. This really is not about us and the Palestinians. This is about Iran and the West. And Hamas is an expendable pawn that Iran is using, not against Israel, or not just against Israel, but against the West. There was a very interesting quote from this evening that was in Arabic that I got on a Hebrew news feed from the Deputy Secretary General of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who literally came out and said, this is not a war against Israel. This is a war against the West headed up by Biden. And the worst nightmare that Israel and the United States has is if the Northern Front heats up. And the implication was, who's running this war? Well, Iran is running this war. So the battle is between Hamas and Israel, but the war really is between Iran and the West. There is a possibility, and I do, maybe because I'm optimistic, I do believe it's a possibility that at the end of this thing, that there's a chance for the Saudis to be heroes and finance a kind of Marshall Plan for Gaza. And we talked about that earlier. The best thing that ever happened to Nazi Germany was to be conquered by the United States. The best thing that ever happened to Imperial Japan was to lose the war to the United States, because we went in, we denazified, we poured in the Marshall Plan, as they say, a shitload of money. And today, West Germany is or Germany, there is no longer an East Germany. It tells you how old I am. But today, Germany is our staunchest ally in Europe. And our staunchest ally in the Pacific is Japan. So it is possible. It's been done before. I would hope that whatever government is in power when this is over in Israel has the wisdom to say, let us form a Western/Sunni Arab Israeli coalition to rebuild Gaza as the Singapore of the Middle East. That's not going to be easy, but I think it is a possibility, and I think it is doable. One thing for sure is that Israel doesn't want to reoccupy Gaza, but it's going to have the freedom of movement in Gaza to root out any vestiges of terrorism, just like American troops had to occupy Germany all the way up into the 60s. There were still vestiges of Nazism in the 50s in Germany, and we all know the stories of Japanese holdouts who were found 10 years after World War II, 15 years after World War II, in caves, still waiting to die for the emperor. So there are going to be little pockets of resistance here and there where Israel will need the freedom of movement. Would you run the video clip first, showing the barrage of rockets? As Jenny does that, look at the clip. You'll see the barrage of rocket come up from the right side of your screen. You'll actually see a couple rockets, if you look closely, begin to fall. Not just one, several of them. And that's because roughly 30% of their rockets fail. And then you'll see on the left side of your screen a massive fireball explosion. So if you can run that, we'll see it all. So here come the rockets. You can actually see that's a rocket that looks like it was falling. There's another one that looks like it was falling. And now you see the fireball explosion. So I think it was that last one where I said that's another one that looks like it was falling. That, I believe, was the rocket that hit that thing. So if you could go to the slide now, this is based on the printouts from Iron Dome. This is an aerial photograph of Gaza. Superimposed on that aerial photograph, you can see the various borders of the little towns within Gaza, and the white lines are the trajectory of that barrage of rockets. The red dot is the launching pad, which was in a cemetery located behind the hospital, and then the white dot is the impact on the hospital itself. And if you look up here, you'll see different rockets which are being launched at the same time, and their trajectories are being tracked as well. That's what Iron Dome does. So we know how reliable it is because that's what the system was built to do. That's why it saves lives. We can track literally every rocket and know where it's going, and that way we can decide whether or not to try and intercept it or not. Okay, that'll do it.
So you do have a few questions. I don't know if you can you see those, Dan?
I see.
I could read them out loud if you like.
Sure.
The first question is, so what can we do?
That's a great question. You can donate money, and there are numbers of places that you can donate it to. I'm in the process of setting up an emergency relief fund, but I can tell you right now that there are numbers of places where the money will not go to overhead. There are a lot of Jewish charities where 40 to 80% goes to cover overhead. I would give directly to the Jewish Agency for Israel, and I know for a fact because the president of the Jewish Agency for Israel is Doron Almog, Major General Doron Almog, who is a dear friend of mine, who, by the way, lost 6 members of his family in Kfar Aza, 2 parents and 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, all murdered. I called Doron and said, what are your immediate needs? And he said, I can tell you right now, $7.7 million, which no one is covering. We're at the end of our budget year, and we need to give short and long-term grants to people whose homes have either been damaged beyond repair or totally destroyed, either by the rocket attacks or in the terrorist attacks along the Gaza village, the Gaza envelope. And he said, the government will not give us a new budget till after the first of the year. And there's no other agency that's stepping in to provide the money for those grants. So if you look up the Jewish Agency and see how to donate to it, that's great. I can just tell you from my own brigade, the Givati Brigade, we had 150% people show up to Givati. And Givati, by the way, is the brigade that will spearhead the ground incursion into Gaza. We spearheaded it in 2014. We'll do it again. we'll take the most casualties and we'll kill the most enemy and we'll take the most territory. And they are short right now because they have so many people show up. They literally don't have enough ceramic plate vests. They don't have enough helmets. And so they're looking for donations to augment their equipment. And if anyone's interested, I can provide a link to Rabbi Alicia, and then you can donate directly to Givati. That would be great. Or the Jewish Agency. That would be great. There are other Jewish organizations. The UJA is a great organization, but they also give to federations. They also have a lot of different places that they feed money to. And by the time money gets to Israel, it's not the same amount that you gave. So I personally would give to Magen David Adom, which is the ambulance service and is in desperate need of more ambulances, unfortunately. And they're always a wonderful place to give to. And I can provide a link to that as well.
We actually have that link on our webpage, so people can go to that and just click right on the link. Thank you, Dan. The next question is, how did the CIA know in advance for a couple of days about the invasion while IDF did not?
You know, I've heard a rumor to that effect, and I don't really believe it, because the CIA would have shared that information with Israel almost immediately. There's a very, very close relationship between the two entities. When we talk about what an intelligence failure this was, it was not only an Israeli intelligence failure, it was an Egyptian intelligence failure. It was a British intelligence failure. I think it was a CIA intelligence failure as well. From what we know, they went dark in terms of not communicating via cell phone or computers. Everything was, handwritten messages passed like Osama bin Laden used to communicate. And we relied way too much on technology, but worst of all, we relied on our assumption and we cherry picked facts to support that assumption. So I've heard a rumor that the CIA knew, but I don't really believe it. I could be wrong, I just don't believe it.
Behind me is the flag of Israel. It was based on the talit and a reclamation of the star to wear in pride. And so we'll end this with Am Yisrael Chai. We, the people of Israel, live and will continue despite all of this difficulty and this horrifying time where we are all asking, what can we do? And what we can do is be ambassadors of truth and pride. And everyone you talk to, tell them what you heard. And especially if you, like I have grandchildren or people you know who are in universities and have been bombarded by lies, help them also. And of course, to donate, do what we can. We don't have the blue little pushkis anymore. We can write a check or just send electronically. Dan, we thank you. Toda rabba, achi. And to each one listening, I want you to know that we're going to post this on our website so that you can repeat the lesson and you can tell other people. And this was just marvelous. From Yitzhak, from me, from our whole congregation, we thank you. And to everyone listening, you're doing a mitzvah by learning this information and passing it on. Shalom.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.